of the United States responded publicly to this news. Here's what he posted. Quote, "A very sad thing happened last night in Hollywood. Rob Reiner, a tortured and struggling but once very talented movie director and comedy star, has passed away, together with his wife Michelle, reportedly due to the anger he caused others through his massive, unyielding, and incurable affliction with a mind-crippling disease known as Trump derangement syndrome, sometimes referred to as TDS. He was known to have driven people crazy by his raging obsession of President Donald J. Trump, with his obvious paranoia reaching new heights as the Trump administration surpassed all goals and expectations of greatness, and with the golden age of America upon us, perhaps like never before. May Rob and Michelle rest in peace."
He just can't not do it. This was not prompted by a question. No one asked him to weigh in. This is simply the genuine, unsolicited reaction from the supposed leader of the free world to the news that a couple was tragically murdered in their own home. I mean, truly, what the actual fuck? Even President Snow is like, look, I'm an evil, sinister bastard, but that's just too much for me. See, here's how humans responded.
It could not get any more tragic.
Such a heartbreaking weekend all around.
It's terrible.
You know, a lot of people are talking about the history of this great actor and director, Rob Reiner, and I just want to visit for a moment the impact that, having lived in Los Angeles, many people will tell you that he had on the industry as a whole.
I mean, this is beyond, sensitive, not to mention horrific.
Yeah, that feels correct. That feels like the normal response. Empathy, sympathy, disbelief, emotions most of us experience because we have souls. And in case you were wondering if, when given a chance, Donald Trump would back off those despicable remarks,
a number of Republicans have denounced your statement on Truth Social after the murder of Rob Reiner. Do you stand by that post?
All right, here it is. A second chance, an opportunity to put his mouth in reverse and take back his truly heartless statement. A moment for the man who occupies the highest office in the land to show Americans that people can make mistakes, people can overstep, and when they do, those people can apologize and make things right.
Well, I wasn't a fan of his at all. He was a deranged person as far as Trump is concerned. He said he knew it was false. In fact, it's the exact opposite, that I was a friend of Russia, controlled by Russia. It was the Russia hoax. He was one of the people behind it. I think he hurt himself in career-wise. He became like a deranged person, Trump derangement syndrome. So I was not a fan of Rob Reiner at all in any way, shape, or form. I thought he was very bad for our country.
I gotta be honest, seeing that level of moral degradation, it's almost fascinating. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm burning white hot with rage and simultaneously nauseous with disgust, but a part of me feels like I'm on something similar to a whale watching excursion, where if you wait long enough and you're just quiet enough, you'll get to see one of the rarest forms of life on Earth. The absolutely morally bankrupt billionaire president of the United States. And that's what Trump is, because this is not a case of people on the right or conservative media. This is one man who is so devoid, so bereft of decency and empathy that he literally cannot help himself.
I was surprised by this. Some of President Trump's most rabid supporters, who are the trolls of social media, were out there from last night into this morning saying we didn't agree with anything that Reiner stood for politically, but this is a horrible thing.
You hear that? Even the trolls thought that was a bridge too far. And they made that decision on their own, not pressured by friends, because they don't have any. Now, I'm not sure why we ever expect anything different from this man who is more than happy to shit on the graves of anybody who he disagrees with, including American war hero Senator John McCain.
I endorsed him at his request, and I gave him the kind of funeral that he wanted, which as president I had to approve. I don't care about this. I didn't get thank you. That's okay.
I was never a fan of John McCain, and I never will be.
If only all eulogies could be so touching. Though it may be hard to believe, in times of great tragedy, our country has the ability to put our differences aside and come together to be, at least briefly, not pieces of shit. Yes, many of us could not be further apart politically. Yes, we have wildly different opinions on a whole host of issues, and sure, half the country is exhausted by this whole 6-7 craze, while others are happy to see it continue. For another, let's say, somewhere between 5 and 8 years. But the thing is, some events are so gut-wrenchingly horrific that we hit pause. We lay down our swords, or our microphones, or our increasingly calloused posting thumbs, and we're just fucking decent to one another. But not this piece of shit. Nope, while the rest of us learn of tragic events and see empathy headed toward us, welcoming it with open arms, Donald Trump treats empathy like his White House and will find any way to destroy it. Because he needs the fight. Donald Trump views himself as a wartime president, and in order to will that war into existence, he has to create it. And so he has to dump fuel on the fire and fan the flames. He is the biggest inciter of conflict and the biggest beneficiary of that conflict. Civility and decency, these things are an anathema to this man. This is where he thrives.
I don't want him in our country, I'll be honest with you, okay? Somebody would say, oh, that's not politically correct. I don't care. I don't want them in our country. Their country's no good for a reason. Their country stinks. Let me just tell you, you are an obnoxious, a terrible reporter. But we always take people from Somalia, places that are a disaster, right? Filthy, dirty, disgusting, ridden with crime. The only thing they're good at is going after ships.
Donald Trump needs people who are born in America to hate immigrants. He needs white people to hate brown and black people, and vice versa. He needs people to hate reporters and journalists, regardless of how well of a job they're doing. It is his fuel. In the same way, at the end of the first Back to the Future, Doc Brown had a machine that could power the DeLorean with bananas and beer cans called Mr. Fusion. Trump has Mr. Fission, a machine built to divide things, and it lives inside this motherfucker. And no matter what you put into it, it will figure out a way to use it to sow division. Natural disasters, school shootings, family tragedies, whatever you throw at him, Trump will find a way to use it to his advantage because he needs the war to keep raging. That's what a demagogue does. That is the biggest tool in their tool belt when it comes to hanging on to power. And what is an undeniable shame is how much Rob Reiner's passing has become about Donald Trump's truly disgusting remarks. And that is not okay. Because letting the words of an asshole overshadow the memory of one of society's most treasured directors, producers, and actors is exactly what that asshole wants to happen. The loss of this man and his wife is heartbreaking, and our hearts go out to their family and friends and everybody close to them. Rob Reiner spent decades advocating and fighting for progressive causes in America, causes like legalizing gay marriage and taxing the rich to provide for universal preschool, and he spent even more time making some of our culture's most hilarious, touching, and relevant movies. Movies like The Princess Bride, Stand By Me, and A Few Good Men. And what occurred to me is, while these three movies could seemingly not be further apart in terms of tone, they all carry a very similar theme, which is people standing up to bullies. Inigo Montoya stands up to the Six-Fingered Man, Gordy LeChance stands up to Ace, and Lieutenant Daniel Kaffee stands up to Colonel Jessup. In his politics and his movies, Rob Reiner saw injustices in the world and wanted to show us what courage looked like. That standing up to people bigger and more powerful than you was a worthy endeavor, and that is pretty fucking admirable. We may be wildly divided as a country, our political discourse and hyperbolic rhetoric on pretty much everything constantly driving a wedge between us all. But if you can't look at Donald Trump's response today and know in your heart that our nation deserves a better leader than this, well then, you can't handle the truth. Before you go, if you enjoyed this content and you want to see more and support independent media, please subscribe to this channel. The subscribe button will be right here on the screen. But second, the reality is that we are now in a political environment where this administration can lean on any of the social media platforms to suppress certain voices if they don't like critical coverage. That means my longevity here is in the hands of a few tech billionaires who are already making it clear that they are willing to cater to this administration. To that end, signing up for my newsletter is a way for me to reach you directly if that ever becomes necessary. I'll put the link right here on the screen as well, so please sign up. It's free, but there's also an option to do a paid subscription if you'd like to support me and my team. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for watching.
Good evening. We begin tonight with breaking news. We have obtained what is expected to be a central piece of the government's case against Donald Trump. The actual audio recording of the former president talking as if he's showing a highly classified document on U.S. war plans against Iran with people not cleared to even know it exists, let alone what's in it. In a moment, only on CNN, you will hear what jurors will hear one day. The recording was made 2 summers ago, July 2021, at the former president's club in Bedminster, New Jersey. You will clearly hear the former president as he is speaking to several people. According to the special counsel's indictment, they include a writer working on Mark Meadows' memoir, the publisher, and 2 of Trump's staff members. The president was aware he was being recorded. This is the first time it is being played publicly.
Okay. Imagine being in a federal courtroom, fully expecting a standard evidentiary session in Trump's classified documents case. You're prepared for the predictable rhythm of legal arguments. Prosecutors present, defense attorneys push back. The judge keeps things moving. Then everything changes the moment special counsel Jack Smith presses play on an audio recording. The recording comes from a 2021 gathering at Trump's Bedminster Golf Club. On the tape, Trump can be heard openly discussing highly classified information about U.S. military plans involving Iran. The people listening do not have security clearances. They are not officials. They are private individuals. And then Trump delivers the line that completely dismantles his own defense. Now I can't declassify. That single statement obliterates the claim that he magically declassified documents simply by thinking about it or by taking them when he left office. Reports say the courtroom falls into silence as the reality sets in. Trump is openly acknowledging that the materials are still classified while showing them to people who have no authorization to see them. This isn't interpretation. It isn't circumstantial evidence. It isn't a hostile witness that can be discredited. It's Trump's own voice admitting to the very conduct he has spent years denying. The judge is said to react with visible disbelief as the implications become clear, while prosecutors finally place this explosive recording into the public record, where it can no longer be ignored. This is the kind of moment people need to understand. That's why this channel exists. But before we go further, take a look at this.
Caitlin, first of all, what do you make? This is the first time we are hearing this audio. We'd seen a transcript. There's more in this audio than we actually had seen, I think, in the transcript. What stands out to you?
Yeah, there is more in this. And this is a 2-minute clip of what a recording that we're told is over an hour long. But this is, of course, the part that is at the center of Jack Smith's investigation. And we knew about this. CNN first reported that this existed and that Jack Smith's prosecution had it in their hands. But to hear it, I think, really just drives home and it undercuts everything that Trump has been saying. I mean, even as of a few days ago, he was saying there was no document per se, but you can hear him very clearly in there referencing something in his hands.
Look, so let's unpack what the Bedminster audio is said to capture, why it is so catastrophic for Trump's defense in the classified documents case, and why the fallout stretches far beyond one ugly headline. The recording is described as coming from a July 2021 meeting at Trump's New Jersey Golf Club. This is not a secure facility and not a formal national security briefing. It is a gathering with writers and others connected to a book project, meaning civilians who do not have security clearances and do not have a need to know access to national defense information. That context is crucial because it frames the conduct as voluntary and deliberate. This is not a staff-level error. It is described as the former president choosing to display material that he himself characterizes as military planning and options. Then comes the line that blows his public defense strategy apart. On the recording, Trump says, "Now I can't declassify." Those words are not a technical quibble. They are an admission that the documents remain classified and that he no longer has authority to change that status after leaving office. That is why this kind of audio is called a smoking gun. It is not circumstantial. It is not an interpretation of a witness's memory. It is not a political argument. It is the defendant's own voice in real time, acknowledging the key fact that prosecutors normally fight to prove. The courtroom reaction is described as going silent, and that makes sense. People can debate motives, they can debate credibility, they can debate politics. But it is hard to debate a clear statement spoken on a recording. You can cross-examine a witness, you can attack a narrative, you cannot cross-examine a tape. And that is exactly why this moment matters for anyone trying to understand what is happening. Not through slogans, but through evidence. That is the role of this channel. If you want straight breakdowns that focus on what is in the record and what it means, subscribe right now and check the description for the next update, because the details are moving fast and most headlines are leaving out the parts that actually matter. Now, the Bedminster audio is described as only the beginning. The narrative you provided says Jack Smith follows the tape with additional evidence that creates an overwhelming picture of willful mishandling combined with obstruction and cover-up. One of the biggest pieces is testimony from Yuscil Tiveris, described as an information technology administrator at Mar-a-Lago who initially lied to protect Trump, but then flipped and began cooperating with prosecutors. That detail alone is huge. When someone lies first, then cooperates, prosecutors can argue the person crossed a line, where the cost of keeping the lie became too high. which often means the witness has either credible exposure or credible knowledge. Either way, the shift matters. According to the account, Tavares had access to the security camera systems at Mar-a-Lago, and he testified that he was ordered to delete footage after Trump's lawyers received a subpoena demanding preservation of evidence related to classified document storage and handling. Think about what that means in plain terms. Prosecutors issued a preservation demand. The alleged response was not strict compliance. It was an order to erase the camera record that would show what happened to the boxes. That is not a vague allegation about sloppy paperwork. That is an alleged act aimed at erasing proof after the legal system told the team, preserve everything. This is the difference between a cloudy allegation and a step-by-step narrative a jury can follow. If you can show the subpoena date, then show deletion activity after that date, then show a witness explaining who directed it, prosecutors can argue intentional destruction of evidence with a straight face and with receipts. It becomes nearly impossible to wave it away as miscommunication. It becomes nearly impossible to say this was routine maintenance. Targeted deletion after a preservation demand looks like consciousness of guilt, and prosecutors love that phrase for a reason. Then your script adds another layer, described as a lawyer confession. Smith is said to present evidence where Trump's own attorney admitted under oath to rigging evidence in this case. That is explosive for at least 3 reasons. First, it directly supports obstruction charges by suggesting the defense side was not simply reacting to government pressure, but actively manipulating what the court could see. Second, it undermines the credibility of everything Trump's legal team told the court about searches, compliance, and disclosures. Courts usually presume lawyers are truthful because they are officers of the court with ethical duties. A confession of rigging evidence shatters that baseline. Third, it changes what prosecutors are allowed to seek because it opens a pathway to pierce the veil that normally shields internal legal strategy. This is where the judge's response matters. And the narrative you provided describes the judge establishing a presumption of bad faith that applies broadly across Trump's legal fights. That is devastating because it flips the normal posture of a courtroom. Instead of assuming lawyers are acting properly unless proven otherwise, the court starts viewing the party's claims with suspicion until the party can prove good faith. It is like losing the benefit of the doubt in the most consequential room in the country. That kind of shift does not just affect one motion. It affects every argument that follows. And then comes the legal tool that can turn this from damaging into existential: the crime fraud. Exception to attorney-client privilege. Attorney-client privilege exists to protect honest legal advice. It is not meant to protect planning crimes or covering up wrongdoing. Crime fraud is the mechanism courts use to pierce privilege when there is a strong showing that communications were in furtherance of obstruction or other illegal activity. In your narrative, Smith seeks access to communications about the classified documents, the security footage deletions, and subpoena responses, and the judge orders those communications turned over in full and unredacted because the evidence is strong enough to trigger the exception. If that is accurate, it is a massive shift. Privileged emails and notes are often where intent is most clearly stated because people speak more freely when they believe the conversation is protected. If prosecutors gain access to messages discussing how to hide boxes, how to shape a misleading declaration, how to time deletions around subpoenas, or how to keep certain materials out of search results, you move from inference to direct proof. You move from arguing a cover-up to showing a cover-up in their own words. Your script also emphasizes pattern, and specifically references the idea of hundreds of blocked executive orders as evidence of broader judicial defiance. The point being made is not that those orders are about classified documents. The point is that prosecutors can use other acts evidence to show intent, plan, knowledge, and absence of mistake. If someone repeatedly treats legal constraints as optional, it becomes harder to claim the documents case is a one-time error. It becomes easier to argue that the obstruction conduct fits a long-running approach. Ignore the rules when they become inconvenient, then delay and spin when caught. That pattern theme connects to the contempt referrals described in your narration. Contempt referrals are not symbolic. They represent a court taking aggressive action to punish obstruction and deter continued defiance. When a judge issues contempt referrals, the court is essentially saying the conduct here crossed a line into deliberate violation of court orders or interference with the judicial process, and prosecutors should consider criminal contempt charges against specific officials. That can mean arrests and jail exposure if prosecutors follow through. It also changes behavior, because when real personal consequences appear for aides and attorneys, loyalty gets expensive and cooperation becomes rational. Then you move into what this evidence package means for the larger case posture, including the revival of a 37-count indictment that was dismissed on procedural grounds. The key point you make is important. The earlier dismissal is described as not being on the merits. It is not a finding that the conduct was lawful. It is tied to issues about the appointment or authority of the special counsel. If those issues are resolved or relitigated, Smith can bring back the full set of counts, including willful retention of national defense information, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and false statements, and he can do it with a stronger record because he now has cooperators and potentially access to communications that were previously shielded. Now put the legal catastrophe on top of the political calendar. Your narration argues the timing could not be worse for Trump because it lands during a second term and heading into the 2026 midterms. Every day spent dealing with evidence presentations, motions, contempt disputes, and witness cooperation is a day not spent governing or building support. Even more important, the nature of the evidence makes it harder to spin as an abstract witch hunt. People can dismiss a headline. They can dismiss a pundit. They cannot easily dismiss hearing the words, "Now I can't declassify," with their own ears. That sets up the deeper legal significance of the Bedminster audio. You cite the espionage statute, 18 U.S.C. 793, as the key law governing national defense information. With elements, prosecutors must prove beyond a reasonable doubt. They must show the information relates to national defense, that the defendant had unauthorized possession, that the defendant knew it was sensitive or classified, and that the defendant willfully retained or disclosed it instead of returning it through proper channels. Defense teams often try to poke holes in knowledge. They argue their client did not know the material was classified or did not understand its sensitivity. But a recording where Trump explicitly acknowledges he cannot declassify obliterates that defense tactic because it is an explicit acknowledgement of classification status and lack of authority. It also nukes the declassification defense narrative that has been floated in public, including claims that a president can declassify documents through mere intent or through removing them from the White House. If Trump truly believed he had declassified those Iran planning materials, why would he say, "Now I can't declassify"? That statement only makes sense if he understands the documents remained classified and he understands he no longer has the power to alter that status. So the tape becomes more than a gotcha moment. It becomes an admission that tracks the legal elements prosecutors need. Then the obstruction story returns through the security footage. Deleting surveillance after a subpoena is not just obstruction. It is a bold act of defiance of a court-ordered preservation obligation. And because the witness is described as the person with direct access to the camera systems, his testimony can anchor a timeline. If the jury believes him, the government can argue that the deletion was targeted, that it was designed to erase evidence of box movements and storage handling, and that it was done precisely because the footage would have been incriminating. That is why the timing matters so much in your narrative. It turns an allegation into a purposeful act. The lawyer confession about rigging evidence intensifies that narrative by suggesting a systematic scheme. Not one mistake, not one sloppy act, a pattern of hiding and manipulating. It also triggers forensic suspicion. If one piece of evidence was manipulated, prosecutors can argue they are entitled to deeper review of other material, deeper discovery, and additional testimony from lawyers and staff. It creates a widening circle. Now your narration pushes this to the practical question. What does it mean for Trump's legal future and his ability to serve? A revived multi-count indictment with this sort of evidence implies serious felony exposure. The willful retention charges alone carry heavy maximum penalties per count. Even if sentences would likely be concurrent in reality, the point is that the threat becomes massive and the pressure becomes suffocating. A trial of this scale is not a side project. It is all-consuming. It rewrites the daily reality of governing. It forces lawyers, staff, and allies to live inside subpoenas, interviews, and evidence fights. It also creates pressure on co-defendants and witnesses, because people who face real prison time often decide they are not willing to take the fall for someone else. That is where you introduce removal pressure scenarios, both impeachment and the 25th Amendment. The argument in your script is not that these outcomes are guaranteed, it is that overwhelming public evidence changes the political math. When evidence is locked behind classified walls, it is easier for supporters to dismiss it as unknown. But when a recording is played in open court and becomes part of the public record, it becomes something lawmakers can cite, replay, and use in hearings. That makes it easier for opponents to build a clean and simple narrative for the public. A president showed classified military planning to civilians and admitted on tape it was still classified. That is not a complicated argument. It is a simple one. Then you connect this to the 2026 midterm dynamic. You argue that the attack ads write themselves. Play the audio. Show the cover sheets. Ask voters whether they want leaders who treat national defense information like a bragging tool. Republican candidates in competitive districts face a no-win choice. Defend Trump and alienate moderates. Distance themselves and face primary challenges from loyalists. Either way, the party gets torn apart by the impossible position created by the evidence. But the most chilling part of your script is the national security dimension. This is not just a paperwork dispute. If Trump displayed military planning documents, those pages could include sources and methods, operational concepts, capability assessments, vulnerabilities, and other high-value information. Every civilian in that room becomes a potential target for foreign intelligence recruitment, compromise, or pressure. Even if no one intentionally leaks the material, exposure itself expands risk. You emphasize that the damage can be long-lasting, because once sensitive planning is shown casually, you cannot unshow it. You cannot pull it back into a secure vault and pretend it never happened. The act itself creates vulnerability, and that is why national security cases are treated with such seriousness. And then you return to the precedent. Your narration argues that a successful prosecution on such clear evidence would establish that presidents can be held criminally accountable for mishandling classified information and obstructing investigations. That would change incentives for future administrations. It would tell every future president and every future inner circle that the risk is not just political embarrassment. It can be prison. It can be real consequences. That is a fundamental shift in how rule of law is enforced around the most powerful office. At the same time, the privilege piercing you describe creates another kind of collapse for Trump's defense posture. If crime fraud applies, Trump cannot have candid conversations with lawyers without worrying those communications could later be seized. Lawyers cannot represent aggressively without fearing they will be accused of facilitating obstruction. That creates conflicts, caution, and fragmentation. It makes the defense weaker, not stronger, at the exact moment when the case becomes more dangerous. So when you pull it all together, the Bedminster audio with Trump acknowledging he cannot declassify, the cooperating insider testimony describing deletion orders after subpoenas, the attorney admission about evidence manipulation, the judge's shift toward presuming bad faith, the crime fraud exception prying open communications, the pattern narrative of repeated defiance, the contempt referrals, the revived indictment posture, and the political timing colliding with 2026, you end up with the picture you describe as nearly hopeless for Trump's legal defense, unless something dramatic changes. And that is why the judge's visible reaction matters as a signal. Courts have seen spin, delay, and media warfare. But evidence like this is different. A tape is hard. A cooperating witness describing specific orders is hard. A lawyer confession is hard. And when those pieces arrive together, it becomes difficult to argue that this is a misunderstanding or a paperwork dispute. It starts to look like willful conduct plus cover-up. If what is described here is accurate, this is not a case built on vibes. It is built on artifacts. Jurors understand instantly, and artifacts the public can grasp without a law degree. A recording of a defendant acknowledging lack of authority. Testimony about evidence deletion after preservation demands. Admissions of manipulation. Those are the ingredients prosecutors rely on to prove intent, knowledge, and willfulness. And that is why the stakes are enormous. Legally, it could mean the first criminal conviction of a former president. Politically, it could mean a governing crisis where the presidency is consumed by trial-level consequences. Institutionally, it becomes a stress test for whether the system can enforce rules on the most powerful person involved, even when millions of people are primed to treat enforcement itself as political warfare. And remember, the power of this kind of evidence is cumulative. A single disputed witness can be attacked. A single document can be argued over. But when audio, testimony, court findings, and privilege rulings all point in the same direction, the narrative hardens into something the defense cannot simply talk away. That is why this story is not fading. It is accelerating. And once it is public, it becomes impossible to unhear.
President Trump receives rare backlash from members of his own party today for a social media post about the death of director Rob Reiner. Meantime, Congress is running out of time to reach a deal on the Affordable Care Act tax subsidies. For analysis, we turn to our Politics Monday duo. That's Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter and Tamara Keith of NPR. It's great to have you both here. So look, it was an incredibly callous and cruel post, even by Donald Trump's standards, about the deaths of Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle. So after the apparent homicides, the president wrote on Truth Social that their deaths were a very sad thing and that they would rest in peace. But most of the post focused on attacking Reiner for his anti-Trump politics. And the president even suggested that Reiner had brought his death upon himself through what Trump called Trump derangement syndrome. What makes this moment different, you both know, is the response. You have Republicans, not just Trump critics, but Republicans in battleground districts, members of Congress pushing back, including New York Congressman Mike Lawler, Oklahoma Congresswoman Stephanie Bice. You've also got a number of several conservative commentators also saying that this is really just depraved. What do you make of Republicans breaking rank here?
Yeah, I think there is still a lot of grief over the murder of Charlie Kirk. And remember, there was a lot of consternation by many in conservative circles about the way that they believed people on the left were treating that murder. There were many callous tweets and responses from some about Charlie Kirk's murder, and the approach that some conservative movement took was to say we need to have an absolute truce to this kind of language, that regardless of anyone's political opinion, something horrible happens to them, we do not go and use those political beliefs against them. In this case, the president did not. What's different, you're right, though, is the fact that individual members of Congress and members of the sort of MAGA faithful coming out and overwhelmingly pushing back. I think a lot of this is a feeling that, the president in this case is taking what they had hoped to be a sort of moral high ground and had undercut that.
Tam.
Yeah, I mean, you did see some members of Congress contorting themselves to try to defend the social media post. President Trump himself was asked about the pushback that he was getting, which you described many of it. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Congresswoman from Georgia, Republican, very MAGA until recently, also pushed back. If you looked in the comments on Truth Social, and, that's a pretty self-selecting group, a lot of people in the comments were like, sir, are you sure? Maybe don't do this. But President Trump was asked about this pushback, and he doubled down. He was asked in the Oval Office. He continued to trash Rob Reiner and his politics. It seems very clear that Reiner's politics had nothing to do with his murder. But President Trump often finds a way to make everything about himself. And that's also what that post did.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's move on. We are heading into another week on Capitol Hill here with votes planned on the Affordable Care Act. No agreement yet on extending the enhanced subsidies. What, if anything, has actually changed? Has anything changed?
I know. Well, there's a lot more conversation.
Yeah.
Just talking to folks today who are following this a lot more closely than I am, they have not given up the belief that something can happen on these healthcare subsidies, whether it's at the end of the year or the very beginning of next year, that even as there's no cohesive agreement on this, there are two paths, it seems. One is go through the regular order of things, have a vote, maybe an amendment that includes subsidies for the extensions, which many moderate Republicans want. The other is to go around regular order with this so-called discharge petition. It would mean that some of those moderates would have to join with more than 200 Democrats for a 3-year extension. Now, if that second path happens, we talk a lot on here about the president's hold on his party, whether it is loosening. That would be a sign that the president's grip is absolutely loosened if members of his own party are willing to team up with Democrats.
Where is President Trump in all of this?
And that's the $5,000 million question.
Yeah.
He has been pretty unengaged, I think, is the best way to describe it. He's talking about he wants health savings accounts. He wants the money to go directly to the people. It's kind of like he's having a conversation that is completely different than the conversation that is happening on Capitol Hill. And there's no momentum behind what he's talking about. There's also no muscle behind what he's talking about. He's not trying to force Republican members of Congress to do this thing. He's just kind of musing about what would be an idea. But there isn't like real pen to paper. There isn't a specific plan. The House is voting this week on a measure from the Speaker that does not include what President Trump was asking for. The Senate voted on something that you could, if you squinted, you could say that was basically what the president was talking about. It didn't get enough support because it turns out to get things through the Senate, you still need a bipartisan majority. You need 60 votes. And that means you need some sort of compromise, which just isn't happening. I will note in terms of timing, just very quickly, today is the deadline to sign up for Obamacare plans in most states if you want your insurance to start on January 1st. So the deadline is here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Amy, you pointed our team to the interview that President Trump gave the Wall Street Journal, where he's talking big picture about his economic policy to include health care. And he more or less openly acknowledges that his economic policies may or may not translate into political wins for Republicans in the midterms. I mean, what does that reveal about how the White House, how he is thinking about the potential political payoff from his economic agenda?
His economic agenda and this healthcare agenda.
Yeah.
He knows that both of these things are critical to his party's ability to hold on to the House. We know that he and members of his team pressured Republicans in these states to redistrict in order to help keep the House. Here you have two opportunities to help your party keep control of the House, healthcare and economic policies. And yet he seems to be sort of taking a back seat and saying, well, in this interview specifically, he says, I guess maybe 2026, it won't have kicked in yet. In other words, his economic policy is kicking in. But the other thing he says is, historically, it's very difficult for the party who's in the White House to keep the House. This is also a very tenuous time for Republican members. They're going home for the holidays. This is when many of them have the sit down with their families. Should I run again? What do we think? Put in another 2 years, put in another 6 years. They're seeing the president's approval ratings at an all-time low. They're having this fight over health care, not able to come together. There is obviously a lot of tension, intra-party tension within the House conference. And now they see the president saying, well, I don't know, it's really hard to win in a midterm year when you're the party in power. It's not a great sort of send-off to those folks who are contemplating, perhaps, whether or not they want to come back and fight for their seat.
And not a great start to a campaign, an aggressive campaign tour next year, where I'm told the president's going to go state to state and talk about his economic agenda. And he's not yet confident that it will actually be able to deliver a midterm win.
Yes, he is distancing himself because he always distances himself from things that don't look like a sure thing to be a win. A quote from this Wall Street Journal article that really stood out to me. He says, I've created the greatest economy in history, but it may take people a while to figure these things out. Essentially saying, well, it's the people's problem, not mine.
Tamara Keith, Amy Walter, thanks to you both.
You're welcome.
Welcome.
Their chance of solving a murder is cut in half if they don't